Hey everybody, welcome to RotoCurve Live for Week 5, presented as always by our great sponsors in rosters.com. If you haven't signed up over there yet, please be sure to go over there, use promo code CURVE for an instant $20 bonus on your initial deposit. Doesn't get any better than that. As always, welcome to RC Live. This is Week 5. I'm your host, Josh Kalachi, here as always with two of my best friends in the whole world. We're like a little wolf pack, Adam Pfeiffer, Jim McCormick, and we're here to help you cash in NFL DFS for Week 5. What we're going to do here is we're going to go through our favorite players at each position. We'll give you an idea of who's going to be in our lineups, who we're going to be targeting in cash and in tournaments. And, of course, at the end, as always, in all of our RC Live shows, we will have bold calls. We had some good calls last week. I know Adam called both of those Oakland receivers going for 100 yards and a touchdown. They averaged for more than that because Michael Crabtree scored 400 times. So for this week, without further ado, let's just dive right into it. NFL, Week 5, quarterbacks. Adam, we'll start with you. You see anybody else who's going to score 9 touchdowns this week?
Yeah, I like Michael Crabtree at quarterback this week. No. So this is like the perfect spot almost for Ben Roethlisberger. The only thing to make it better is if he didn't go nuts last week and his ownership was bumped. But, I mean, you look at the Steelers' offense and what they want to do and what the Jets' defense allows other teams to do, and it's like the perfect scenario. It's the perfect marriage. I mean, Pittsburgh, the Jets stop the run well. They're terrible against the pass. The Steelers throw the ball downfield a lot, and the Jets give up a lot of deep passes. So right now, Pittsburgh has completed the third most 20-yard passing plays. The Jets have surrendered the third most 20-yard passing plays, the sixth most passing yards per game, the third most yards per completion. They're dead last in yards per attempt allowed. And we know Ben Roethlisberger is going to take shots. Only Matt Ryan has thrown more passes of 20 yards or more in the air than Ben Roethlisberger this season. And, of course, we know Ben Roethlisberger at home is so much better than Ben Roethlisberger on the road. Top 10 quarterback in 7 of his last 8 home starts. Yeah, this is just a great spot for Roethlisberger. Revis, for whatever you think about Revis, is doubtful, I think, just came out. So, yeah, I think Big Ben has another monster game this week.
You mentioned Big Ben, and he's one of my favorites this week, too. We do our ownership percentages each week on Thursday night, of course, from Fantasy Ace's largest GPP field. We like to take a look at the ownership percentages and how they present themselves. Those are up. Every player up over at RotoCurve.com. Ben Roethlisberger is the highest owned quarterback this week at 33%, which I thought was interesting because there's another quarterback that I think a lot of people will be on for cash games this week. Jim, why don't we let you take the reins there? He's back.
All right, he is back. Mr. Brady is back. There are some interesting stats to consider with Brady coming back. He's played 0-4 teams, I believe, 6 times in his career, and he has 19 touchdowns and 2 interceptions in those games. In 2 of those games, he's had 6 touchdowns each. And the idea being this isn't a situation where they're going to let up. I mean, this is kind of like Coach Krzyzewski beating up on Wake Forest, meaning like they're going to keep the starters in the whole time. They're going to beat up and push the point total up. Even though they're 10-point favorites and this can seem like a LeGarrette Blount game, I still think that, you're seeing 303 is kind of the expectation. I won't call it the floor. It's kind of the median outcome for Brady. But really the ceiling is crazy high. He has kind of Roethlisberger's ceiling and maybe even arguably a better matchup because as good as Roethlisberger's home setup is with the secondary, you still have Leonard Williams, Wilkerson, and I really, don't get me wrong, I'm not going against – I love Big Ben. I have him picked in my rosters column this week. The idea is that there's really no pass rush for Cleveland. There's nothing in the way of angry Brady going off.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more there. This guy is going to be one of these players that is just so highly owned in cash, although I was surprised at Big Ben's ownership percentage of Thursday night. I just don't think you can fade him right now in cash games unless you are that confident that a guy like Ben Roethlisberger has a chance to absolutely blow up. But for me, I'm going back to the well. It's not RC Live unless I talk about Phillip Rivers, right, guys? I mean, every single week I mention this guy, and this week is no difference. The Philadelphia Raiders, that would be a thing, wouldn't it? The Oakland Raiders allowed 820 yards and 7 touchdowns in the first 2 weeks. Since then, they've been pretty good, and that's Phillip Rivers' matchup this week. But I want to dive into that a little bit more. In those 2 games, the Raiders' defense faced Joe Flacco and Marcus Mariota. Now, nothing against either one of those 2 quarterbacks.
No, Mariota sucks. He's banned from this damn show.
We're never going to talk about him again.
100% banned.
So yeah, that's who Oakland faced though. A guy like that, who obviously Adam touched a little bit of a nerve there, but Mariota struggled, of course, this year. Joe Flacco isn't necessarily the most elite of quarterbacks. A little bit of a pun there for those that know that joke. But the thing about those two teams that Oakland faced before, they could throw the ball. We saw the Saints absolutely destroy that secondary as well. So I think that this is a week where Rivers enters that third quarterback realm of excellent games against the Raiders. We talked about how Rivers' volume has not been up in the first 2 weeks of the season, but in the last two, we've seen his volume well over 40 per game. He threw the ball 39 times and 43 times in the last two. We know about the Chargers' defense struggling, and with how good Derek Carr looked last week, this has the makings of a shootout. I definitely think that's the way this game could go. Considering Rivers is second in our NFL cheat sheet for quarterbacks, everybody on Derek Carr, everybody on Tom Brady or Ben Roethlisberger, I'm going to be taking Phillip Rivers in tournaments at just 8% owned right now on the Thursday through Monday GPPs on Fantasy Aces. So not a lot of people are on him this week, so I think this makes for an excellent spot against a secondary that definitely leaves a lot to desired. So, Adam, your second quarterback this week. We talked about Big Ben, but who's the other guy you're looking at?
Yeah, and real quick, the thing you gotta like about Rivers this week is that there's no John Kuhn to take touchdowns away. So, but my favorite tournament quarterback last week, my favorite tournament guy was Ben Roethlisberger. I'm hoping to go 2 for 2 here. Andrew Luck. Nobody's gonna be on Andrew Luck because the Colts offense continues to underwhelm. He's getting sacked a ton. He's got the jet lag narrative and everything. But I think at this, he's like a perfect GPP play because he's in that price point where you can just pay up a little more to get Brady or Rodgers. Roethlisberger's $100 cheaper, but this is a guy who's averaging 40 pass attempts per game because the Colts defense is so bad. Per Pro Football Reference, only the Dolphins have a higher trail rate than the Colts at 72.8%, which is insane. And the thing about Luck is, he's getting pressure a lot, but Chicago's not generating a lot of pressure right now. They're 21st in pocket pressure. They only have 6 sacks through 4 games. They're so banged up. All their pass rushers are hurt. So I think Luck and T.Y. Hilton is like a super interesting GPP stack. The volume's going to be there. This game has a relatively high total. The Bears defense has played well in terms of what they could be. With how banged up they are, but they're still a team we should be targeting with how depleted they are. Luck's been under pressure 42% of the time this season, but I don't think it's going to be nearly as bad against Chicago. And if they can't generate a pass rush, it'll be a nice little change of scenery for Luck, and I think he could have a big game. And nobody's going to be on him. I think his ownership was less than 5% on Fantasy Aces on Thursday.
It was 4%, Adam, which basically means he is in an excellent spot for tournaments. So good call there. Jim, who's your second quarterback that you're looking at this week?
Well, for one, just to follow up on that idea, I do think that there's something going on with the Bears sample size here and who they've played. I don't think that secondary is as good as the numbers. So to kind of corroborate what Adam's saying about Luck, they also, if you think about it, they face like the Eagles, the Cowboys, even the Lions. They haven't been faced with a vertical offense yet. And that's exactly what Luck is in terms of average depth of target and average air yards. I mean, Luck the last 2 years has led the league in, the number of 10 yards plus, air yards past the sticks kind of throws. And that's exactly how they beat teams. So I think they haven't been faced with field stretching, yet. And I just think that's something that could really challenge their secondary. So I kind of agree. It's a nice dark horse. I like Eli Manning here on the road for a bounce back. I mean, some of this is just the natural correction. I mean, he's got 2 games without touchdowns, and the volume they're throwing the ball at, and he's regularly dropping back 40 times. Obviously, we know the whole drama situation with Odell, but I mean, I think we can all agree that like Odell is still Odell, and there's nothing really going on outside of there's been some bad matchups, and they really haven't hooked up yet. So I just think there's a correction coming, and the Packers have a pretty solid run defense right now. It's one of the best in football, actually, with Mike Daniels playing well and the way that they bracket stuff with that 3-4. But their cornerbacks and their secondary is pretty exploitable right now. I mean, Morgan Burnett's banged up. Shields probably is. I haven't checked the most recent.
He's already ruled out.
He's already ruled out. There you go. And so they're 27th in pass coverage on Pro Football Focus. They give up the most yards to receivers per game in the league right now. It's like 230 yards per game to receivers. So I just think, we'll talk about, stacking him with Beckham a little bit later, or even right now, I guess. But I just like Eli for a bounce-back game, and just TD rate-wise. I mean, if he's going to be throwing the ball 40 times and his TD rate's 5 or 6%, we're talking about 302.
Yeah, it's an excellent call there. And a lot of people this week, we thought were going to initially be off of that offense and Odell Beckham. But I see Odell right now at 13% on the Thursday to Monday slate, which is a relatively high number given the fact that a lot of people did play some players in last night's game. And, of course, the Monday night game has some good receivers as well. So that's interesting. But I think we can all agree that passing offense is definitely something to target in tournaments this week. My other quarterback, the guy I'm looking at here, as a little bit of a second-tier guy, 13% owned Carson Wentz, back on the Wentz wagon this week. 3 weeks so far in his NFL career, 19.22, 24.04, and he had 12.6 DK points in 3 games, faced Cleveland, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. We saw about his success so far this season and in his NFL career, especially against the Pittsburgh defense that we thought looked pretty good in the first couple weeks of the season. But the reason why I'm looking at Wentz, that matchup, Detroit has allowed the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks this season, including at least 2 passing touchdowns in all 4 games. That's not something to shy away from. Carson Wentz at 6,400 on DraftKings right now. With those 2 touchdown floor in terms of how the matchups have been against the Lions, that makes him for an excellent candidate. And I actually saw yesterday that Doug Peterson was looking at considering using him in the run game more throughout the season. So if that starts this week, which it potentially could, try to say that 5 times fast, against a struggling Lions linebacking core, it makes for an interesting play here because, as we always talk about, 20 yards rushing, 30 yards rushing, that's pretty close to a passing touchdown. So don't ignore those free points for me. So a guy like Carson Wentz, 13% owned is higher than I would like, but I still like him in tournaments this weekend against a relatively poor defense. Adam, do you have a second quarterback you want to talk about?
I have a third quarterback.
Quarterback, sorry? Yeah.
Yeah, so I really like Derek Carr a lot as well in this spot. You figured this Oakland-San Diego game should be relatively high scoring. And Carr has a lot of upside here. He's played really well this season. It's already a bad defense in terms of just all around, but their best player, Jason Verrett, is now out for the season. I don't know what's in the water in San Diego the last years that everybody's getting hurt there. But this is a good spot for him to score touchdowns. Chargers allowed a league worst 13 red zone touchdown this season on 16 attempts. The Raiders have actually been the most efficient red zone offense in the league this season at a 90% clip. In the red zone. So, the Chargers allowing 290 passing yards per game, 6th most in football. I think Derek Carr is definitely a guy that has, he hasn't had a big yardage game really this season, but with Crabtree and Cooper's still he's gonna get going. So, and without Latavius Murray, if they can't run the ball in this game, which they still could because the Chargers are really bad on the ground, but I think Derek Carr is in a really good spot here, and I like the price tag on him. He's under $7K on DraftKings.
Jim, what about you? I know we both considered this particular passing offense, but I kind of want to hear your argument for why you have a particular rookie here as your third quarterback.
Well, it looks like I just checked practice reports like literally within the last 10 minutes. And it's Paxton Lynch is out there throwing with the first team. Trevor Siemian, rather, is throwing with the first team. He looks likely to start. But here's the thing. They're the same exact price on DraftKings, $5,200. So I'm really fine going with the system itself. As much as we've been talking about this being a running offense, at least that was our first impression coming off of the Carolina game. Anderson looked great. And now it's possibly looking like that's more of an exploitive situation with Carolina than it is anything to do with how this team is built. The idea being, Emmanuel Sanders leads the league in target share of his own offense. Demaryius Thomas has been playing really well himself. Super efficient, only getting 7 or 8 targets a game only, but that's compared to 10 or 11 for Sanders. But he's catching 80-some% of his passes. The real selling point here is that beating up on this Atlanta defense and the way that they want to engage in shootouts is favorable. I just think it's a situation where you're paying near the pricing floor for a quarterback who is at home as a home favorite against one of – first of all, the Falcons have the worst pass rush in football. They've been pressuring the pocket, 19% of opposing dropbacks, the lowest in football. And Denver has one of the better protection lines in football. So it's just a clean pocket, everything goes up. TD rate, yards per attempt. Everything rises in a clean pocket. It's obvious football-wise why that makes sense. So I just think this is a situation where, even in cash, paying down to get these guys, I'm not sure the upside's that exciting for tournaments, but I think the floor is here for, 200-plus yards, multi-touchdowns, especially with those receivers.
It's interesting you mentioned that because actually, and I'm going to give it a little bit of a teaser here, in our premium consensus rankings this week, that's actually the stack that I mentioned. It's Simeon 2, Emmanuel Sanders, and Demaryius Thomas. So I'm well on board with you there, Jim. And honestly, going back to another one of Jim's plays from last week, I really like Brian Hoyer this week. I mean, we're talking about a guy that is at the price floor. Jim just mentioned with Simeon and Paxton Lynch, which looks like Simeon's going to be the guy starting this week for the Broncos. Brian Hoyer is $5,500 on DraftKings, just $6,000 on FanDuel, and he's vastly cheap on rosters as well. In 2 starts so far this season, he has 58 completions, which that's a lot anyway, but he's thrown 85 times. We always talk about volume in NFL DFS, especially at quarterbacks, and that's exactly what you want. Now, has he been efficient? Not entirely, but just under a half a point per passing attempt is still a good number, especially considering the fact when a guy like Hoyer is throwing over 40 times a game. So just quick math there, takes him about 20 fantasy points. At his price, I'm definitely willing to take a gamble on him. The other thing is he has a good matchup. The Colts, who he faces, do have one good corner, and we all know about him and Vontae Davis, but there's nothing after that. So the way I look at it is if Alshon's there and Vontae's covering Alshon, who else is going to cover anybody for the Bears? That's why I think Hoyer makes for an excellent play this week. He has some decent targets to throw to. I know Kevin White's not going to be playing for the foreseeable future for an injury. But a guy like Hoyer at that price against a defense has given up a ton of passing yards so far this year. I think he makes for an excellent play. Jim, do you want to touch on Hoyer real quick? Because I know you discussed him last week, and that definitely paid off.
Yeah, I mean, there is a fear at some point that Brian Hoyer becomes Brian Hoyer again. But I don't think it's going to happen against, like we said, this team where, they're relying on Robert Mathis still to create pressure. I mean, he's going to join Trent Cole in the retirement home soon. There just isn't any consistent pass pressure there. And if they do bring pressure, if you look at their data, it's on the blitz. And Hoyer, for all of his troubles, actually can get the ball out pretty quickly. I think it's a Zach Miller game too. I think a stack with Zach Miller and Hoyer is kind of interesting, especially because, I mean, the Colts are cutting guys like this week. They just cut C.O. Moore. They don't have any coverage linebackers. DeQuell Jackson's a box guy. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's one of those games where we get at least one more kind of upside game out of Hoyer.
Let's move on to running backs here, but before we do that, let's recap real quick. Jim likes Tom Brady, as we all do, and he also touched on Eli Manning and the Denver Broncos quarterback, whoever it may be, looking like Trevor Siemian this week. I like Phillip Rivers, Carson Wentz, and Brian Hoyer as some lower-owned options in tournaments. And Adam mentioned, of course, Ben Roethlisberger, who looks like the chalk this week, and for very good reason. He also mentioned Andrew Luck at under 5% owned, and, of course, Derek Carr. So let's move on to running backs. This week, we saw probably the top running back in the NFL in terms of production so far, and David Johnson last week, just rip apart that San Francisco defense last night. Now, moving on to week 5, the slate we have ahead of us on Sunday. Adam, who are your top guy right now?
I kind of want to just play David Johnson somehow. Oh my God, he's so fun. Yeah, so nobody's really talking about him enough, but he's been arguably the best fantasy running back in the NFL through 4 weeks. DeMarco Murray, I'm going to keep playing him when he's in good spots. Last week against Houston was a sneaky good spot. They've been bad against the run before J.J. Watt's injury, and now he gets the Dolphins. You got to keep an eye on obviously the hurricane situation there, whether or not the game will be moved. But either way, I mean, as long as this game's played, he has a great matchup. The volume's there. He's averaging over 21 touches per game, 124 total yards, over a touchdown per game. And the thing I like about this is just he looks more comfortable. I mean, we obviously know last year with Chip Kelly, the shotgun formation was not something that Murray was, really comfortable with. He had 156 attempts out of the shotgun. So far this year, he only has 8 attempts out of the shotgun with Tennessee. The Derrick Henry hype is just that. I mean, he's not even playing a lot. Murray has the third most snaps among running backs at 205. And the matchup, I mean, the Dolphins are a terrible run defense, allowing 130 yards per game. And teams know they can run the ball, so they're just going to do that against him. They're seeing the third highest rushing percentage against at 47%. The Dolphins are. The Titans are going to want to run the football. The passing game is there for him, 19 catches through 4 weeks. So Yeah, DeMarco Murray, and people are going to be off him again this week because on DraftKings he's priced, with 300 cheaper than Le'Veon Bell. He's the second highest running back outside of, of course, David Johnson, who played on Thursday night. So I think people are going to either pay up for Le'Veon or kind of save a little bit. And I think Murray's in a great spot again to have another big game.
It's interesting you mentioned that because, of course, we all know DeMarco Murray is a former Eagles running back you just mentioned. I feel like they're everywhere, Jim. Doesn't that kind of lead into your next play right here?
It does. I'm going with Shady McCoy. I'm a Pitt alum, so I'm down with the Pitt Panthers, even though Revis is now like a resort, not an island. But no, the Shady McCoy is just a high floor guy. I mean, Adam just talked about the awesome usage floor that we see for Murray. There's a similar kind of share going on here with Shady, right? And in the wake of, I know we're going to talk about, you can talk about Robert Woods having a 29% market share of the passing game the last 2 weeks. But I really think the biggest leap in terms of value fantasy-wise is actually McCoy. In terms of creating bubble screens, increased usage for him as a receiver is really going to add value. His floor is already really high, but almost like an Arian Foster type thing where even if he struggles in the ground, I'm talking about prime Arian Foster, not this injured version, but the idea of being at 100 total yards is really kind of a very achievable rate for him every week. He's no David Johnson, but he is one of the safest yardage floor guys in the game. The Rams might seem imposing because we bring up names like Aaron Donald, who's absolutely dominant. But actually, they're edge rushing with him a lot from the end, not as much at tackle right now. That said, I just think McCoy's in a great position. He's got 19% of the passing game, 65% of the rushing, total. It's just there's a lot of work there. And really, the offense is going to go as Shady goes, and there's no competition for goal line carries. There's really just no competition for meaningful touches. So he's really not that expensive. We've talked about this before, but he's 6,200 on DraftKings. That's like a mid-level, low-level wide receiver too. So if you can find any values to complement at receiver to be able to pay a little bit more for a running back like McCoy, I think he can be your lead back, and you get away with it and get your 20 fantasy points out of him.
Yeah, and it's funny because I don't know if you guys agree with me here, but like both of these running backs, now that they're out of Philly or whatever, like they literally both look like vintage versions of themselves. If you watch, like McCoy looked incredible the last 2 weeks.
It's the smoothies. There's no more. They don't have to drink those smoothies anymore.
Yeah.
So,
but McCoy does have a hand injury that came up. He was added to the injury report today, but he said it's not serious or anything. He's going to play. So McCoy is such a safe floor every single week.
Adam mentioned his guy DeMarco Murray, 7,200 on DraftKings. And he also said he was $300 cheaper than Le'Veon Bell, and we haven't mentioned him yet. So let me just take the reins here. The guy's price didn't rise since his
that was insane.
That's baffling to see, but honestly, just take advantage of that market. 7,500 on DraftKings against the Jets. I'm definitely going to be on him in cash games. And when I saw that, Le'Veon Bell 7,500, that kind of ended the research for me for the week for obvious reason. But let's take a look at a little bit deeper numbers here. Last week, he saw 18 carries and 6 targets in an absolute blowout against the Chiefs. So he's going to be on the field. We've talked about before how Mike Tomlin loves to keep his guys out there. I've talked about before also how I like pass-catching backs against teams that can rush. And we know about the Jets' defensive line. They're excellent. But I think this is a perfect spot for a guy like Bell, who they're going to use in the screen game against the pass rush. So I'm really going to be on him for his pass-catching floor, especially at his price on DraftKings. Whereas Jim mentioned, he's $2,500 cheaper than some of the top receivers. So using him in that third slot maybe, or as a third guy, you want to use 3 running backs rather than 3 receivers in your flex, definitely take advantage of the price difference there. Also, Le'Veon Bell lined up at wide receiver last week. It wasn't just as a decoy. He caught a few passes. Of course, that just adds more to his value. And the way that I look at this game is, although the Jets can be good against the run, they've allowed 3 receiving touchdowns, to running backs this season already. Already 19 catches, and we know Le'Veon Bell is, if not the best behind David Johnson, he's right up there in terms of pass-catching backs. So for me, this is another week where I'm going to use him. Problem is, just 12% owned right now in Fantasy Aces for the Thursday to Monday slate. Now, David Johnson was highly owned at 25%, so this will change. Do not think he's going to be a low-owned play this week. Le'Veon Bell will be the chalk, but it's definitely worth using in cash games. Jim, let's move on to your second back here because this is a guy I definitely want to hear your take on because I know a lot of us love him.
Yeah, I mean, again, talking about chalk, I mean, Jordan Howard, he's still underpriced, meaning just in terms of usage, it's not commensurate. His pricing is not comparable to really what his production is right now. So we have an opportunity to find a high floor player. Adam and I just got done talking about guys that we expect to have around 20 touches. That's what we're looking at with Howard. The Colts are awful against the run. They rank 32nd in run defense. Like I said, they just essentially fired or released whatever synonym you want to use to get rid of C.O. Moore. He was leading the team in snaps on inside linebackers. So they're really just struggling to find an identity to slow down the run. You can run on them all day. And Howard, there's no competition. People talked about Kadeem Kakari. He had 89% of the carries last week, did Howard, and he had 12% of the passing market. And the week before, he had 18% of the passing market. So this isn't a player who's solely limited to running. Again, it's just a 100 to total yard kind of situation, and any touchdowns are going to push him into kind of a slate shifting kind of performance.
Yeah, I agree. I think all of us agree that Howard's an excellent play this week and well deserving of that chalk tag that people are going to be labeling him with. Adam, who's that next guy you're looking at?
Yeah, so keep an eye on his status. I think he's dealing with a hip injury right now, but like on FanDuel, obviously, especially, LeGarrette Blount could be really interesting in tournaments because everybody's on the Brady hype. Everybody's on the Brady to Edelman, Brady to whatever. But, this is still – and it'll obviously change a little bit with Brady, but this is still the most run-heavy team in the NFL right now, the Patriots. Blount's averaging 22 carries per game. This is like the only running back we've been able to trust in a Belichick offense in the last 5 or 6 years maybe. And if we think New England's just going to pour it on and destroy this Browns team, then you got to think if Blount's out there, he's going to have so many scoring opportunities. New England this season with their, without Brady have been bottom 6 or 7 in red zone scoring attempts, but with Brady all last season, they were second behind Arizona. So, they're going to move the ball with Brady here. Blount's getting the goal line work, and we know Blount is much better and a lot more favorable in games where New England are heavy home favorites. And, when New England's at least an 8-point favorite, Blount's averaging around 14 fantasy points per game, which is fine. Reasonable floor there. I think he has 2 touchdown upside here, and nobody's really going to be on him, especially with Brady back. So I don't hate LeGarrette Blount.
You mentioned nobody was going to be on him, and for those fantasy aces, ownership percentage we have so far, 7%, Adam. That's a perfect target for a running back, especially if he gets all that volume in tournaments. The guy I want to mention is my second back here is a guy I got a chance to watch live last week in Baltimore, and that's Terrence West. The guy looked really, really good. I mean, we didn't see any targets, so that's one thing, but he's still very cheap on DraftKings, 4,800. We know about him being an excellent play on FanDuel. But a lot of people, I think, may be too worried about Kenneth Dixon. Terrence West is just 9% owned right now on the Thursday to Monday slates, and I think that's a mistake. Harbaugh said they were going to work in Kenneth Dixon. We know Dixon has been hurt, and he hasn't played an NFL snap yet, of course, being a rookie out of Louisiana Tech, I believe it was. So a guy like that isn't going to take all the work away from Terrence West, who had 21 carries last week. He has one of the highest floors, I think, given the fact that he's going to play a lot of snaps. He's second behind Carlos Hyde in touch percentage, which is also an excellent number to look at. His matchup, too. I mean, this Washington team has allowed 7 rushing touchdowns already through 4 games. That's not good at all. They've allowed a league most 532 yards on 2 running backs on the ground. So the matchup is there. The volume looks like it's going to be there. The price is low. And if his ownership somehow stays low like that at 9%, I think he's one of the top plays on the slate. Do you guys agree? Adam, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I don't think they're gonna just throw in Kenneth Dixon as a rookie who's coming off a sprained MCL, I believe. And they cut Justin Forsett, and this is pretty encouraging to me because the first couple weeks they were just using 3 or 4 backs and it wasn't working, and then this past week really they had 2 guys and the snaps were a little bit closer. I think it was around 41 to 27 or 44 to 27 in favor of West, but he dominated the touches. He had 21 carries. I think Buck Allen had 4 touches. So I think you can definitely. I think this might be the last week for Terrence West. But yeah, this is the matchup to kind of ride him off in.
Yeah, I mean, the Redskins are giving up 5.15 yards per carry. Another situation, they can't stop anybody. They're not that much different than the Colts in terms of, they're rotating inside linebackers. I mean, it's just they've lost both safeties already this year. David Bruton was their box safety. So
Yeah, just signed Dante Whitner.
Exactly. There you go. Dante Hittner is in, who is, he should change the name to Dante Overpursue. So, there's going to be a lot of opportunities here. And honestly, if you're just going to play game script wise, they're best built, commanding a home lead here. So, yeah, the only fade option would be if you think the Redskins are going to get up, because then that might trend towards, them passing more. But still, it's also the goal line thing, right? There's no competition for goal line carry, so he could sneak away with kind of one of those old school kind of LeGarrette Blount type lines, or maybe let's go really old school, like a TJ Duckett line, and have 14 carries, but end up with 2 touchdowns.
Yeah, I think that's the floor for him as well. Like you mentioned, with the say if it's 30 yards and 2 touchdowns, that's 15 fantasy points. I think that's a good place for him to be at, given the fact that he's going to get that work. And like you just said, if they're up by a few touchdowns or maybe 10 points at least, Baltimore is going to try to run the football. And at this point, I can't believe through 5 weeks we're talking about a Baltimore running back at DFS. It's crazy how the league changes that fast. It looked like they were going to be a 3 or even 4-headed monster when everyone was healthy. Mm-hmm. So, Adam, let's go back to you. That third running back spot is going to be one for the ages this week. There's so many good options. Who's your number 3 right now?
Yeah, I don't think people are talking about C.J. Anderson enough, probably because he hasn't been really efficient the last couple weeks, but you're still averaging 20.5 touches per game, playing over 70% of the snaps, which is really encouraging because that number was around 45% last year. So they're more comfortable with him and obviously they've cut guys in the offseason. But this is an Atlanta defense that can't stop anybody. 5th most fantasy points allowed to running backs. Denver's calling run 46% of the time, the 5th highest clip in the league, but at home it's up to 49%. So they're going to run the football here. They're home favorites, like Jim said. 6,900. His price is very affordable. He's second in the league in red zone carries. I think this is a great spot for Anderson to get back on track. It's just a great matchup, and he's one of my favorite running backs to watch. He's very difficult to tackle, and the Falcons aren't the greatest of tackling teams, especially at their linebacking position.
Dim, did you like another back in that game? Did I see that right?
I like the potential for Devonta Freeman here. I also actually even like James White, to talk about 2 guys that to go kind of mid-level cheap and then truly cheap. I mean, Freeman, the idea being, we've talked about Coleman and the risk here, sending him. Apparently there's a connection with altitude and the sickle cell situation that Coleman unfortunately deals with. It's a kind of a dangerous thing because of like the blood thinning situation. So it could be coach speak, the idea that Coleman's going to play his full role. Why would they reveal anything different? And also just the idea that Freeman is one of the best running backs in the league. I know that we talk about his opportunity share is compromised, and after week 1, that kind of would have seemed blasphemous just because of, we're so we're so biased. We just are. Even those of us who try to avoid recency bias, it's difficult when you see snap shares and stuff like that because we value opportunity, which is obvious. So I just think Freeman is in a good position. The Broncos, don't get me wrong, they're a good rush defense, but they're not as dominant as they were last year. They're still an absolutely dominant pass rush and secondary, if not better than last year. But, the loss of Malik Jackson, the idea that, they lost Trevathan, who was probably their best run-stopping linebacker. It's just there's more there. We've seen Jeremy Hill go off a little bit. We've seen the ability to have total yards against them. And even though Freeman hasn't been used in the passing game, he has got a lot of upside in that sense. Obviously, he's a very skilled receiver. He was probably the best receiving back in football last year. And then the other guy is James White. Just the idea that last year, to go to like a per opportunity rate, he was second behind Charles Sims in fantasy points per route run. And that a lot of that had to do with he was playing that Dion Lewis receiving role. And Tom Brady trusted him. I mean, he actually scored some touchdowns to end the year. And I just think they're going to run that hurry up, boom, 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 Tom Brady offense, that quick, blur of an offense that keeps the defense, on the field and not able to make substitutions. Well, that's going to be a position that White fills, not Blount. And so I do agree that Blount could be the finisher and still get his 100 yards and 2 touchdowns, which would obviously be valuable. But I really think that White is a guy who kind of has a sneaky setup here for 80 total yards or maybe 65 total yards and 6-7 catches, which, in the sub 4,000 range is pretty valuable if you're going to be, paying up like all these top receivers we're about to talk about.
Yeah, and while I'm fine with Blunt, like when Brady's under center, the Patriots, they run the football by throwing short passes to the running back.
Right.
Like that's how they run the football essentially. So, yeah, I think James White's going to be really, really sneaky because, Brady's going to get the attention. Edelman's going to get a lot of attention. But then James White is, he was really, really good when Deion Lewis went down last year. So.
Yeah, it was interesting with White because he's coming from an offense in college in Wisconsin where they didn't throw the ball ever. They could be down 40, still run the ball. I had the chance and I guess the blessing of meeting him. He's a great guy at the Senior Bowl, and he really showed his pass blocking prowess. And I think that's what allowed him to be drafted by the Patriots. We obviously saw his pass catching ability. So it's really crazy seeing a guy come from that system to be such a good pass catching back. I'm on him as well this week, as well as Freeman, as Jim mentioned. I just wanted to touch on Freeman real quick, though. If Tevin Coleman doesn't play as much, which we know is a possibility given the situation he's dealing with, we saw just how good Devonta Freeman can be with full workload last year. I mean, the guy was running back one for a reason for a long time, excellent receiving back, over 70 catches. So he can get the job done regardless of the matchup there against Denver. So it's an excellent point you just made there, Jim.
Yeah, I think sometimes what we miss, and we all do this, but we talk about like a player's risk and a player's downside, but we also have to figure in that like the market's pricing that risk in, right? Like Devonta Freeman's not very expensive. So a lot of the risk we talk about usage-wise is already factored into his price. So like it's not like you need him to play above his opportunity rate. And like you said, if his opportunity rate goes up, then we're talking about profit.
Exactly. The last running back I wanted to touch on here before we move on to those receivers is Jerick McKinnon. You remember Carlos Hyde last week?
Yeah.
Adam, I know you touched on this in your article. Jerick McKinnon is Carlos Hyde this week, basically. I mean, 4,000 on DraftKings. There's a very similar situation in terms of his price being far too low. And real quick, touching on McKinnon, since becoming the starter, and I say that in quotation because Matt Asiata started the first play, McKinnon has 34 carries and 7 targets in 2 games. Both of those games came against stout defensive front sevens. This week he faces Houston, which on paper, when injuries are turned off, are a very good front seven. But unfortunately, without Watt, they have allowed 100 yards and a touchdown, 2 touchdowns rather, in back-to-back games. So this is not a good front seven right now, at least in terms of how the statistics have been allowing against them. McKinnon's an excellent player in terms of his shiftiness. He's going to get those carries that we talked about his work in the last 2 weeks. And with the matchup and the price there, I just don't think it's a good idea to stay away from him, especially in cash games. And that's reflective of his 24% ownership percentage this week.
Yeah, and it's not like he never gets red zone work. Like he had a touchdown from inside, I think, the 10-yard line last week. And I think Minnesota's defense is going to get multiple turnovers in short yardage field situations on Brock Osweiler. So, yeah, McKinnon is almost an auto play on DraftKings for me.
I agree. Let's recap running backs real quick. Adam mentioned DeMarco Murray, LeGarrette Blount, and C.J. Anderson as 3 backs this week. I talked about Le'Veon Bell. As always, he's going to be an excellent play in cash, along with Terrence West and Jerick McKinnon. Jim touched on some interesting names like Devonta Freeman and James White, who are excellent tournament plays. He also mentioned 2 guys you can use in cash, volume hogs, so we could say, in LaShawn McCoy and Jordan Howard. So let's move on to receivers. There's a lot to talk about here. So, Adam, take it away. Who's your guy this week?
Yeah, I'll get the chalk out of the way with Julian Edelman. We know this Patriots offense is pretty much the talk of DFS right now. They should be in a great spot to go nuts. But this is also just in general a great matchup and spot for Julian Edelman. You look at the receivers to go off against the Browns this season. A lot of them have been slot guys. Jordan Matthews went for 7, 114, and 1 in the slot in week 1. Jarvis Landry in week 3 went for 7, 121, and 1. Mike Wallace, not a slot guy, but he was essentially serving as Baltimore's #1 passing option that week, and he scored 2 touchdowns. And then last week, Jordan Reed, who lines up in the slot 47% of the time, had 9 catches for 73 yards and 2 touchdowns. So they cannot stop the slot. I mentioned Scott Barrett of Pro Football Focus a lot on the show. He points out that they're allowing over 20 fantasy points per game from the slot. So Edelman, who's obviously, like anybody, is better with Brady under center. 6 more PPR points, 2 more receptions, nearly 3 more targets per game alongside Brady since 2013. I think he's in a great spot to have one of those 11-catch, 90-yard, 2-touchdown games potentially. I think he's a cash game lock.
Jim, what about you? Who's that top guy you're looking at? I think we may all agree here, although he could be a little bit of an under-owned play.
Yeah, I'm going with the drama king. I'm going with Odell Beckham. He's just very moody, but he's also incredibly talented. There's not many people that can check him off the line, and I really don't think anybody on Green Bay, who we already went over, is 27th in pass coverage. Sam Shields has been ruled out, as Adam noted. So it's just a situation where, let some recency bias play into it, where, I think there is some correlation here, especially because not everybody distinguishes between season long and daily. That, I think even Adam said this, on Twitter this week, that, it's not really that bad of a start for Odell. It's really just the missing touchdowns. Now, don't get me wrong, that's a big factor. But it's one of those things where in 2 or 3 weeks, if he has a couple touchdown games, everything's normalized. And I think this is one of those opportunities for things to normalize. Again, like I said, just stabilization rates in terms of volume of passes versus touchdowns. This team is just due. They're just due for a big game. I'm not really afraid of this Green Bay defense. I think they've been getting away against – look, who has Green Bay really played offensively, right? The Vikings aren't a good offense, and they really couldn't stop them. They got burnt by Diggs really badly. The Jags aren't a good offense, in terms of balance. And so I just think this is one of the better offenses they're going to face. And everything goes – we talked about how the Patriots move the ball through the pass. Well, the same thing with the Giants. Everything has to move through the pass. And honestly, just narrative-wise, it's a game to get Odell the ball.
Yeah, so Rich Rebar pointed out on his worksheet column in RotoWorld that at this point of the season, Odell Beckham has 2 fewer receptions and 4 fewer yards than he did at this point last season. So he literally has just not scored. He's averaging 10 targets per game. And this is one of those spots where the Giants are going to have to throw the ball. They're not going to be able to run the ball with Darkwa and a banged-up Rashad Jennings against the best run defense in the NFL. And if you look, the Packers have given up the career best days to Marvin Jones and Stephon Diggs this season. So they're giving up massive games, 9 for 182 and a touchdown against Diggs. Marv went nuts for 6 and 205 and 2 touchdowns. So, I think Beckham has multiple big plays in this game. I love Odell Beckham in this spot.
I'm with you guys here. I'm going to be targeting him in a few GPP lineups myself. He's just 13% owned right now, which seems like a relatively high number for a contrarian play. But given the fact of his ownership, usually in most weeks, this is lower owned for a guy like Beckham. And he still has that talent, like these guys before me just mentioned. All he needs is that touchdown or two, and then he's normalized back to his normal.
And why do we keep flipping out? Everybody wants to say that the Vikings are this elite defense, but after Rodgers has a bad game, we're like, what's wrong with Rodgers? Beckham has a bad game against the best team against number 1 receivers in fantasy, the last year and a half almost, and everybody flips out.
I think it's because Odell is he's the new TO in the sense that he's the sideline guy, and so I think it just magnifies everything. And honestly, when you have 12 memes per game,
that's a new stat. We got to start tracking that.
Yeah,
good idea, Jim.
Exactly.
Yeah, Eli's got it. The Giants are leading the league in memes per game.
Oh no,
Eli
doubt.
and Odell Beckham.
True.
Not even close. And Jason Pierre-Paul. It's a wrap.
I'm going to have to start tracking that. Thank you. I got to see a place that I can get some data. The guy I'm looking at in this game as my top receiver this week is in the same game, but on the other side, Jordy Nelson. Can't really say too much about this guy, although he has gone under the radar so far this season as a wide receiver 1, partly because the Packers were on bye week last week, so people seem to forget that. In 3 games, though, Nelson has 27 targets for 206 yards. He has 4 touchdowns. And listen to this, red zone stats. Nelson leads the NFL in red zone targets, red zone receptions, and red zone touchdowns. Once we get to the red zone, Rodgers will be looking Jordy Nelson's way. That was an issue with the Packers offense last year, seemed to be corrected. We also know about the Packers offense at home in the past couple of years has just been incredible. The way I want to look at this matchup, the Giants defense have been better than what we expected, but take a look at this. They have faced 2 defenses that do not throw the ball in Dallas and Minnesota. In the other 2 games, they faced the Saints and the Redskins, which we do know throw the ball. Combined, the Giants have allowed 425 yards and 3 touchdowns to receivers in those games. That is not a good number. And for the number 1 receiver for the Packers facing that defense, Jordy Nelson at home, I'm in. Jim, who's your second receiver?
Jordy's a dope tournament play. Nobody's really talking about him.
Agree.
And Rodgers at home on Sunday night is is like a lock. So
I wonder if there's something. I mean, I don't know what the data would be, but I wonder if there's some relation between ownership percentages coming off bye. Just because there's not really any recency like success or to drive them. So it's kind of like how, I don't know, like last week seems like a month ago. So 2 weeks, seems like forever ago. And that's the last time we saw this Packers offense. And I agree with Adam that like there's this perception even from that Vikings game, because it was nationally televised, that that Rodgers and these guys are kind of a fade candidate. I think it's also because Randall Cobb is like playing like Randy Newman, or Randy Quaid. I don't know, pick your Randy. But I have Brandon Marshall. The only reason he's in this second tier for me is because the pricing is fairly depressed. He's in the mid sevens here on DraftKings, and he's not, and he's comparably expensive on FanDuel. It's just a situation where no Decker, higher target share, and the Steelers have given up the most passing yards per game over the last year. Robert Golden's out, the safety. Shazier, their best coverage linebacker's out. Not like he's going to be lining up too much with him, but just the idea that, there's a lot of potential here for volume, and there's also game script potential with the idea that, you're facing one of the top offenses in football, if not really the best offense now that we have Le'Veon back. And so, you're talking about the ability for a lot of volume for Marshall and really not a lot of defensive talent in his way. And I just think if this year there was a negative correction on the way in terms of touchdowns, we're already seeing that that's happened and that's being priced in. He's not going to get 14 touchdowns this year, but he's like a double-digit touchdown guy. And I don't think people realize how rare it is for receivers to get 10 touchdowns plus. And Marshall, it's like a definable skill that he has. It's not like a random thing. It's 5 or 6 years now where double digits is a norm for him, which is to say 100 yards and a touchdown is incredibly likely for this guy. And there's only like maybe 3 or 4 guys in football you can say that about each week. I mean, Amari Cooper hasn't scored at all this year. Some guys that we value similarly to him in terms of price don't have the scoring pedigree.
Yeah, like Alshon Hopkins.
Exactly.
Those guys. I love Brandon Marshall this week. My other guy, I'm back on the Marv. I mean, I was never off, but I love Marvin Jones in tournaments. He is probably my favorite tournament play of the entire slate. It's like the perfect spot for him in a GPP because he went absolutely nuts in week 3. Everybody was on him in week 4, and he had a okay game, but because the Lions offense struggled, he didn't do much. So people are going to be off him against this Eagles defense that has been incredible this season, have not allowed a passing touchdown, but I'm expecting back at home for the Lions this game to be kind of a shootout. And Marvin Jones is in the spot where you want to target the Eagles defense. If he sees Jalen Mills in coverage at all, he could roast him. Mills is allowing 67% completion rate, 16.3 yards per catch, and we know Marvin Jones is a deep passing option in this offense. Wide receiver ones against the Eagles. I've been talking about it for a while now. 14 of the last 18 games, the opposing wide receiver one has gone for 80 yards or a touchdown. And keep in mind, a large portion of those guys have scored. So I think Marvin Jones, seeing most of the targets here, they're going to have to throw. Love him in tournaments, especially because his price didn't move. So he's still kind of priced awkwardly. So I'm going to have a lot of Marvin Jones in tournaments, to nobody's surprise, really.
Hey, Adam, I want you to take a little bit of a guess here. What do you think Marvin Jones' owned percentage right now is on Thursday to Monday? I have it right here.
6.
-2, 4% owned. So there you go. You're going to be in fantasy land there. No pun intended.
Yeah, give me all that.
Absolutely. My second receiver this week is a little bit on the cheaper side, but I'm going to be spending up at running back in a few spots. So I did want to mention Steve Smith against Washington. Smith comes in as a very, very highly rated receiver. He's number 2 in our cheat sheet at the position, and for good reason, against the Redskins. Washington has allowed 784 yards and 5 touchdowns to receivers this season on only 79 targets. And this is notable because that's nearly 10 yards per target. That's a lot. That's a large number, and it's a touchdown every 15 targets. Steve Smith has 22 targets in the last 2 weeks, which means if you correlate that for how bad the Washington pass defense has been, that gives him about 110 yards. That's good. If he gets that touchdown, that's another bonus. Just 5,300. I want a guy that has that market share in that passing offense against a team that allows 40 PPR points per game. So for me, Steve Smith definitely looks like an excellent play this week. And right now on Fantasy Aces, he's 15% owned for the Thursday to Monday slate. So a lot of people are on him, and I think for good reason. Let's move on to these cheap guys. Jim, let's start with you.
Sure. At receiver, there's paying down, like you said, isn't always advisable in terms of, especially on the PPR league formats. We want a little bit of cost certainty, but I'm going to go with a guy who doesn't have an incredibly high reception floor, but has an awesome ceiling, which is Sammy Coates. Something about Coates to note is that he's not Martavis Bryant, newsflash, but what he is running the Martavis Bryant routes. He's averaging 19.9 yards air yards per target. To put that in perspective, I did this study this summer for ESPN called Relay, and what it is relative air yards. So it's what it is trying to understand what's the gap in air yards between one player and the rest of his teammates. So meaning, what's his role relative to his team? Sammy Coates is like third right now in Relay, meaning he is one of the top deep threats on his team and in the league because no one else in his team is competing for those routes. Antonio Brown's average depth of target is 11 yards downfield, which is nice, but is comparable with Marshall and all these other kind of possession guys. They let Brown do a lot of his work after the catch. With Coates, it's only going to take 2 or 3 receptions to get him close to 100 yards, and I'm not kidding. I mean, he's averaging 25 yards per catch, or whatever it is, 23 yards per catch. He's amazing in terms of big play potential. And like we already mentioned, this Jet secondary is beat up and exploitable. Also, he led the team in targets last week. I don't know what you guys think about Marcus Wheaton, but I think the sample size is proving he's really just not that good at football right now. And he really, this year, anybody who was up on him for opportunity only. And really, there's not much to speak about his talent, and his route running. And he had 1 target last week. So far, Coates has more snaps, targets, and routes the last 2 weeks. So this narrative that he'd be pushed back to a slot or like a complimentary role is not true. He is the tournament guy for me to stack with Ben.
It's an excellent point you make there, Jim, and I did not expect this, but 13% owned. So a lot of people are thinking like you, and I think that's a really good thing.
The price is so low. You know what I mean? Like it's and in that group, what I was trying to say is that like that group of receivers is usually like your floor guys. It's usually like your Edelman, not your Edelmans, it's usually like your Cole Beasleys. You know what I mean? It's like your Crowders. It's the guys who can get you 10 to 12 points. This guy can get you 30 points.
Yeah, he can get you 10 to 12 in one play, as you just mentioned. So that's an excellent idea to stack there because if you pay up for Ben, that's expensive. But if you pair him in a stack with Sammy Coates, you're looking at 2 relatively under-owned or underpriced guys combined when you look at it that way. So that's an excellent play. I like that idea. Adam, what about you? It's another deep guy that I think plays for the Redskins. Is that who you're on?
Yeah, so whoever is playing wide receiver and going against Sharice Wright is probably going to be a decent play.
Yeah.
Dude is getting roasted. My man Crabtree roasted him last week. 16 catches, 205 yards, and 5 touchdowns allowed in coverage the last 3 weeks. And Jackson and Crowder and company, other than Reed, weren't really a factor last game against Cleveland, but that's because they didn't have to be. I mean, Reed was dominated in the slot. Matt Jones was running the ball well. They're going to have to take shots down the field this week. And, D-Jax went against Wright last year and had 5 catches for 119 yards and touchdown against him. So at 5,900, I think the price is definitely fair. I think Washington's going to have to throw the ball a good amount in this game. They want to throw the ball, especially in the red zone. So I like Deshaun Jackson a lot this week.
My third guy, my cheap guy here is Eddie Royal this week. He's just 6% owned right now, which I think will go up.
Got to keep an eye on him.
Yes,
he didn't practice all week.
Exactly. So that will go up if he's healthy, but if he's not healthy, of course, be sure to remember that he will not play. Of course, Vontae Davis is going to be on Alshon Jeffrey. So if Eddie Royal plays, that means he's going to be covered by crickets. Nobody. Exactly. So
just cut Cromartie.
Yeah. So nobody else can cover that guy. And honestly, he's been a guy that's just been a vulture in DFS for a long time, dating back to a few different teams. 6% owned, I think that will go up. I mentioned that. But the way I wanted to look at it is, regardless, that price is too low for me to ignore, especially if I'm going to pair him with my third GPP option at quarterback in Brian Hoyer. 4,200 on DraftKings. He caught all seven of his targets last week. I mentioned the matchup is basically he might as well be going against me in the secondary for the Colts. Trust me, I can't cover Eddie Royal. So this is going to be an excellent play for me this week. But as Adam mentioned, keep an eye on his status because he hasn't practiced all week. And usually that could mean he's sitting. But a veteran like Royal, he can pick up the offense, pick up the tape, and be ready to play on Sunday.
If he doesn't go, you have Cameron Meredith at $3K on DraftKings.
That sounds like a basketball player. I don't know if I can.
He caught all 4 of his 5 targets after Kevin White left the field last week. So he could be a thing. We'll see. That's
interesting. I'm going to have to keep an eye on that because, like you said, there's nobody else there. I mean, Cameron Meredith might be a play indeed. I can't believe I'm saying it, but if Eddie Royal's out, Hoyer to Meredith stack. That's winning the Buckies this week. What do you guys think?
Hope not.
All right, let's recap receivers real quick. Adam likes Marvin Jones, as he has every single week since he was born. Julian Edelman and Deshaun Jackson. Jim and I and Adam also, all 3 of us like Odell, but Jim also mentioned Brandon Marshall and Sammy Coates. So it looks like Jim's going the route of guys that are 6'4" or taller this week at receiver.
It's true.
For me, I also like a 6'4" guy, Jordy Nelson, and then 2 guys that are very small in Steve Smith and Eddie Royal.
Don't you ever call Steve Smith small?
No, he's definitely would hurt me. That's why.
Dude, he's not going to be covering him exclusively, but I would love to see Norman and Smith get into it.
That would be a lot of fun.
Be amazing.
That would be a lot of fun. All right, we got one position left. Let's go into tight ends real quick. Adam, why don't you mention your favorite guy this week?
Zach Ertz or die. I mentioned this in my article. I don't like tight end this week. You have Jordan Reed, who's obviously a great player, but Baltimore's been incredible against tight ends for 2 years now. Gronk is, not 100%. He only ran 13 pass routes last week. Greg Olson's on the Monday slate. You have Jimmy Graham on a bye, other guys on bye. So, I'm just looking at really Zach Ertz, and then I'm kind of punting. This is obviously a prime matchup. Detroit, over the last 20 games, Detroit has allowed 18 touchdowns to tight ends. So far in 2016, 6 touchdowns to tight ends. Ertz is apparently 100% ready to go. DeAndre Levy's still banged up for the Colts. They just can't figure out how to defend this position. So Ertz is the guy I'm looking at right away for tight end.
Yeah, I'm with you on Ertz, and I think Jim can agree. The way that Ertz is in this offense, or we saw in week 1, he was targeted quite often. He can make plays on third downs. He's a red zone target. So, Jim, did you want to add anything to Ertz? Because I think all 3 of us like this guy.
Well, yeah, it's just a staple of this, this Peterson offense. He wants to get these guys in the field a lot, and even if you're talking about these 3 tight end sets, Ertz isn't the guy who's going to be sacrificed as a blocker. He's the go tight end. One other guy that I think in that same price range and that same kind of mold in terms of he's a key target, we've mentioned it before already, is Zach Miller. I think that might be the logical stack with Hoyer if you're going to go that route, just because, obviously Alshon has the verticality that you look for, but if Davis is shadowing, I just think the middle of the field's wide open for Miller. And then one more guy that I actually don't mind just in terms of paying down is Charles Clay. He's another guy whose target share has jumped above 20%. I don't know. Adam might have some more counsel on this because Clay's been really disappointing as a big money get for the Bills, but he's actually I don't know what you guys think. He's not that bad on tape. he's talented. They just never give him the ball.
No, I like Charles Clay as a player. I was kind of happy when the Bills brought him in. It's just Tyrod is either taking shots downfield or he's scrambling, and
right.
You would think now is the time because they all they have is Robert Woods and Clay. So I would like to see Clay get more involved. It just hasn't really happened yet.
So maybe he's a little bit more of a contrarian guy than someone to build around, especially with Ertz.
Oh yeah, no. Here's the thing about the Bills. Nobody's going to be on their passing game in general, and if they are, it's going to be either naked
Woods.
Tyrod or Woods. So
right.
Nobody's going to be on Clay. It's interesting.
Yeah, Charles Clay is 1% owned right now. I can confirm that for you, Jim. So nobody's going to be on him.
That's only Charles Clay's own lineups. He plays himself every week.
Yeah.
So.
There you go. Exactly. Now, I'm just going to talk about my favorite tight end before we move on to bold calls. You guys are paying him down a little bit, so I'm going to go contrarian and pay up for Jordan Reed. He's 7% owned right now, which I think is far, far too low given the price range that he's at with Gronkowski. Some people are going to use him regardless because Tom Brady is back. But let's break it down real quick. In terms of DVP, Reed is not a good play. But DVP can be misleading sometimes. You have to take a look at how these players line up. As Adam mentioned earlier, Jordan Reed lines up in the slot 47% of the time, I believe he said, about half the time. So you know he's going to be getting away from C.J. Mosley at least for some snaps. At 7% owned, the way I'm looking at this is the way I approach things is once lineups are locked, after that, price doesn't matter. It's all about ownership. So a guy like Jordan Reed with that upside at 7% owned, I'm definitely going to be looking at him because he scored last week. He finally got in the end zone. He did it twice. He has 7 or more targets in each game this season. He has caught 25 of 35 targets for 263 yards. And the way I look at it as him when he lines up as a receiver against Baltimore, Baltimore has allowed quite a few passing yards and touchdowns this season. We talked about Sharice Wright. We know Jimmy Smith hasn't been as good as the Ravens would have liked him to be out of Colorado. So I like Jordan Reed, the receiver, but he's eligible at tight end. Let's move on to bold calls. This is my favorite part of every show we do, RC Live, but my favorite person doing bold calls is Jim because the guy just doesn't miss. Jim, who's your bold call this week?
Well, it's Sammy Coates. This guy is. Look, Adam dreamed about it. Okay, so it's gonna happen. It's gonna happen.
I tweeted it, man. I had a dream that Sammy Coates caught 2 long touchdowns. I cannot make this up.
And so. I'm only predicting 1. So there you go. Like in Adam's subconscious, he's scoring twice. But we just said it already. I mean, whenever he does catch the ball, it's 20+ yards downfield. They're gonna really just push the ball vertically. Big Ben has a big arm. Everything matches up well. And then my bad bold call, which doesn't really help Josh here, is I just think this San Diego offense, I think it's almost a little bit New Orleans-like where they do well at home. I think we talked about this before the show. Khalil Mack was living in the backfield last week with against the Ravens. He's leading all 4-3 defensive ends in pressures. It's kind of like a doubles to homers kind of rate, meaning he doesn't really have the sacks yet, but he has tons of pressures. That's going to convert into home runs, into sacks. He's going to get to them, and I just think it could be one of those games. I don't know. It's a gut call, but I think it's a game where the Raiders kind of run away here.
All right, so you don't think Phillip Rivers is going to have a good game again, do you?
That's my guess. I'm gonna guess that he is outside of the top 15 in fantasy quarterbacks.
All right, let's take all of the Rivers out of my lineup.
No, you don't have to take him out. No, I could be wrong. I could be wrong for sure. I just don't think that team travels as well as others. Again, that's not as empirically based as it is also, just last week, for example, this is a good stat. In the first half, the Saints only pressured Rivers once, and he completed 83% of his passes. In the second half, they pressured him on 30+% of his dropbacks, and he only completed 50% of his passes and no touchdowns. So of anybody who needs a clean pocket, it's a guy who has depleted receivers. And I think that's what's going on here. He doesn't have his go-to receiver. Inman was just open on that one play. I just don't know if he has that security blanket when pressure comes.
Yeah, and you know that the Raiders are going to get pressure on him. So that's an excellent way to look at that. I'm glad you mentioned that stat because I did not know that. So I will have to go back and look at things. And like you said, you don't have to take him out. But Jim mentioned 300 yards and 2 touchdowns from Hoyer last week, which is basically exactly what he did. So
yeah, right.
Adam, what do you think this week? Bold call. Who's good? Who's bad?
So Julio Jones just roasted this Carolina secondary. On Monday night, Mike Evans will double that. He's going to have 600 yards.
Wow, 600.
No,
that's a lot of yards.
No, in all seriousness, though, I think Todd Gurley's the running back 1 this week. I think he has his best week. I know it's not a great matchup on paper against the Bills, allowing just 3.6 yards per carry. Marcel Darius is supposed to be back, but he suffered an injury in practice. He's questionable now, and this will change if Benny Cunningham's active. But if Benny Cunningham's out, we saw Gurley have a career-high 5 catches out of the backfield last week. That's huge for his game. You know the Rams are still going to run the ball 47% of the time they're running the football. I just think it's a sneaky spot for Todd Gurley at home in a game they're slightly favored. And we've seen talented running backs have big games against Buffalo. You saw Forte on Thursday night, David Johnson a couple weeks ago. I still think Todd Gurley is an immensely talented running back. So Todd Gurley will finish as the RB1 in fantasy is my good call. And this isn't really a fantasy call, but my bold call for bad, I guess, is that the Philadelphia Eagles will lose their first game of the season this week.
No!
All right. Well, how do I boot Adam? You know how to work this again?
No, I'm just expecting that every team has their letdown game, and I like Carson Wentz. Like I was dead wrong on him, and he's good, but I don't think this Eagles defense, at least the back end, is as good as they've been. I could be dead wrong because the Lions are the Lions, but like, I don't know, man. This feels like a spot where the Eagles should just, especially with Jim Schwartz, just run in and dominate in this game. But just have a weird feeling that this is where the Eagles, like, I just can't picture the Eagles being 4-0 through 5 weeks. Like,
either can I. But yeah, no, I think the one thing that you have going here for this call would be that they're kind of like Kansas City-ish, not only in the fact that they completely took their template, is the idea that they're not built to catch up ever.
Yeah.
Like the way that they move the ball. We'll see. It'll be interesting. There will be a day when Carson Wentz like lowers from heaven and has to join us in earth.
Like you would, like I like Wentz in DFS, and I don't think this is the week he has his bad game, but it's like I don't know. I can't picture the Eagles being 4-0. Like nobody thought they'd win 5 games all year. Most people. So I don't know.
I'm one of those people.
That is an interesting call you mentioned there because now I have to predict the Bills are going to lose every game for the rest.
Yeah, but that's not like bold.
I know. I'm just kidding.
I made the playoffs since 1999.
I think my bold call this week is going to piggyback off Jim again, and I really agree with him with the Broncos passing game. I think the Broncos quarterback, whoever starts, who does look like Trevor Siemian, will throw 3 passing touchdowns this week. My bad bold call, and doesn't really look too bold now after we kind of bashed on Gronk a little bit during the show. I think Gronk does play, and he has under 5 fantasy points. So if he catches a touchdown on the first play, you know where to find your mentions. Just destroy me at Josh Kalachi. But I think Gronk has under 5 fantasy points. Broncos score 3 touchdowns. And as Jim mentioned earlier, the way that offense sets up, it looks like they're going to be passing the ball more. So I do think that's a good way to contribute in a cheap way for your DFS lineups. That basically wraps up Week 5 RC Live. Thank you guys for tuning in. Real quick, before we move on, it's Friday, so we have 2 days until the NFL starts. Be sure to go over to RotoCurve.com. Check out those ownership rates, which we have discussed all show. All of our tools are up. We have an optimizer up where you have a great replace tool where you can pick all of the guys that you wanted to mention for your lineups. Red zone snaps, targets, touches, snaps. We have consensus ranks. Adam and I are trying to beat some other guys at RotoCurve right now. Adam's in the lead. And he had 9,000 points last night from David Johnson, so it's going to be tough to catch him.
Yeah, buddy.
We even have a DFS pro, Brian Healy, who has 3 live finals and 8 seats to these live finals. He has a cheat sheet on site. It's been very successful already this season, so be sure to go check that out. We know about Adam's pieces. The other one was just published, so we have it bargains, cash, and GPP picks. Jim has an excellent rosters market watch piece, which I love reading each week to like to play on rosters.com. Problem is, I have to go to another state to do so because Delaware is not fun right now. All this content we just mentioned, under $1 a day. What a bargain. Thing is, you're a very good listener. If you're listening to this, you've listened all the way through. You've dealt with my stuff. You've dealt with Adam. You've dealt with Jim. We're going to offer you $2 off a weekly membership this week. So sign up for a weekly membership. You get 7 full days, only $5. Does not beat that. This has been RotoCurve Live for Week 5, as always, presented by Rosters.com. For Adam Pfeiffer and Jim McCormick, I'm Josh Kalachi. Good week, good luck this week, and good week this luck. Either way.